Hi, everybody. How are you today? I wanted to come to you today and give you a brief summary of this chapter two of the book, The Souls of Black Folk. This is a classic book written by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and he talks about, life in the 20th century, basically, is what he's talking about. And he was talking about the current state of affairs of our country, of how they're going to handle the relationship between, basically ex-slave masters, as he calls them, and the freedmen, which was the black race at the time. And so he begins that. But before I do that, would you please like the video if you like the content, subscribe to the channel, and also suggest other books in the comments. Also, leave a message. Leave your, if you feel like after my summary I've left some things out that you feel are important because you read the book before, feel free to share those with me. So he begins the chapter 2, which is called Of the Dawn of Freedom. He begins the chapter and he says, with a strong statement, he says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relationship of the darker man in the world to the lighter man. But he lists the cons: Asia, Africa, and things like that. So he's talking about in the world. What's the relationship going to be like? Because basically you have, when he says, but the relationship for over 200 years before that, before slavery was ended, was you had slave masters, or you had the white population and you had the black population, which was slaves. So you had the white population who was in power. They were able to own land. They were able to be educated. They were able to build wealth, things like that. And the black race, who was enslaved, they weren't able to build wealth. It was illegal to educate them. They weren't allowed to just be free or own land or things like that, start a store or anything like that. So now you have a black race that is free and a white race that used to own them or be dominant over them. And now they're free. And now they're supposed to look at each other as equals, or white people are supposed to look at black people and give them the same rights, the same respect that they give each other. But they've never had to give blacks that before. So this created a problem because, like, blacks didn't have anything after slavery. They didn't have any land. They didn't have any education. They didn't have money. So he talked about that one of the things that could have happened if the country just would have totally abandoned blacks at that time, like set them free and just abandoned them. He says that that freedmen could have basically ended up in another practical slavery again. So one thing that he spends a lot of time talking about in this chapter is something that formed that was called the Freedmen's Bureau. It's just kind of formed. It was like basically today it's kind of be like a nonprofit organization, formed in the 1860s. It was to sell land to the freedmen. It was to purchase land to start schools for freedmen and things like that. It was to socially uplift former slaves. You got to think, in the South, many Southerners, he says, it was unthinkable. It was actually practically unthinkable for them to give black people the same rights as they had. One of the things they talked about was we heard a lot. He talked about in this chapter was the 40 acres and a mule. So the Freedmen Bureau was to start free Negro schools and like free elementary education. So educate the young kids. He said there was a lot of opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau because in the South they felt like an educated Negro is a bad Negro. One of the other things the Freedmen Bureau was to help blacks when they had to go to court, because like back then, basically before there was the Freedmen's Bureau, if a black got in some type of trouble, they were almost doomed, no matter what the crime, no matter what it was. So the Freedmen's Bureau was like to help to make that more of an even kill. He says basically back then in the court system, blacks were involved with the court system. they would basically end up in a situation where they became a slave again to the state or to their owner or whoever else. So the Freedmen's Bureau was to, help start and protect the system of free labor. So like blacks could be basically discuss their own wages. They couldn't be forced to work. They could pick their own employment. It was to help them in the courts, also to establish schools, and to help them establish land. There was a lot of opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau. A lot of Southerners felt like, basically, if they're free, why are we taking care of them? So basically, they kind of fought the Freedmen's Bureau. They did checks of the constant checks of the Freedmen's Bureau. In the end, the Freedmen's Bureau ended up getting shut down because there were some kind of they're saying there's some kind. Du Bois said there was some type of maybe the way they handled the books or the papers weren't being done right, so they got him on that. He says many Southerners felt like the Emancipation Proclamation was a crime. He talked about two things that helped blacks during that times was there were some philanthropists who wanted to help, and there were some eager black men who wanted to move forward. So that was a lot of what he talked about in chapter 2 was the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau to help blacks kind of, help them along the way, help them to do things that they've never done before. And he also talked about how once the Freedmen's Bureau was kind of like defunct, one of the things that was established was the 15th Amendment. So once again, this was chapter 2 of W.E.B. Du Bois' book called The Souls of Black Folk. And this chapter is called Of the Dawn of Freedom. Once again, like the video, leave me a message, subscribe to the channel. If there's things I left out because you've read the chapter before, like I said, please feel free to discuss things that you feel are also important to the chapter. Thanks for listening.